He sold a country that never existed, and people thanked him for the opportunity. That's the part that never sits right once you really think about it. They didn't just believe him. They trusted him with their lives, their savings, their children, their futures. And when they realized the truth, many of them were already dying. This is not a story about a clever trick or a harmless con. This is the story of how confidence, paperwork, and social status became a weapon in the hands of one man, and how an entire society helped him pull the trigger. His name was Gregor MacGregor, and he may be the most dangerous liar most people have never heard of. Gregor MacGregor was born in 1786 in Scotland, into a family that was respectable but unremarkable. Not poor enough to be desperate, not rich enough to be secure. That middle ground is where ambition grows teeth. From the beginning, Gregor learned how important appearances were. Who you knew, how you spoke, what uniform you wore. He wasn't brilliant, but he was observant. And what he observed was simple. People listened to confidence long before they listened to truth. As a young man, he joined the British Army. Not because he loved discipline or duty, but because the army gave him something far more valuable: legitimacy. A uniform creates authority even when the man inside it doesn't deserve it. Gregor understood this instinctively. He learned how to carry himself like someone important, how to speak as if he expected to be obeyed, how to let silence do the work when others hesitated. His military career itself was fine, not heroic, not impressive. But that didn't matter. What mattered was what he took from it: titles, references, and a story he could embellish later. And Gregor was very good at embellishing. After leaving the army, Gregor drifted. Britain was full of men just like him, ambitious, underqualified, hungry for recognition. The competition was brutal, but the early 19th century offered something unique: distance. The further a story traveled, the harder it was to verify. And there was no greater distance, physically or psychologically, than the so-called New World. South America was in chaos. Colonies were rebelling against Spain. New governments were forming and collapsing. Names of places most Europeans had never heard were suddenly appearing in newspapers. To investors, it sounded like opportunity. To liars, it sounded like freedom. Gregor traveled to Central America and attached himself to revolutionary movements. He wasn't essential, but he was present, and presence is often enough. He met leaders, he listened, he absorbed terminology, titles, and just enough context to sound legitimate later. And somewhere along the way, Gregor MacGregor realized something crucial. Nobody really knew what was happening over there. Maps were vague. Borders were theoretical. Reports were inconsistent. Governments changed names and leaders overnight. If a man wanted to invent a place, truly invent it, there might never be a better time. So Gregor did something extraordinary. He invented a country. He called it Poyais. According to Gregor, Poyais was a sovereign nation located on the Mosquito Coast, along what is now Honduras and Nicaragua. It had fertile soil, navigable rivers, and a mild climate. Its capital city was called St. Joseph, a civilized place with stone buildings, paved streets, a cathedral, an opera house, and government offices. Poyais had a constitution, a flag, a currency, and most importantly, it needed settlers and investors. And Gregor MacGregor was its ruler. He didn't call himself king. That would have sounded ridiculous. He called himself the cazique, a title that sounded foreign, ancient, and official. He claimed he had been granted this authority by indigenous leaders. He produced documents, treaties, seals. Everything looked correct enough that no one wanted to be the first person to say it wasn't. When Gregor returned to Britain, he did not act like a man asking for money. He acted like a man offering opportunity, and that made all the difference. He wore elaborate uniforms decorated with medals. He spoke calmly, confidently, with the tone of someone who had already succeeded. He answered questions without hesitation. When pressed for details, he gave them, not vaguely, but precisely. Exact river names, exact crop yields, exact land measurements. Specificity disarms skepticism. He published a guidebook for Poyais. It was professionally written, detailed, and optimistic. It described fertile valleys, healthy climates, friendly natives, and economic promise. It included maps, diagrams, charts, the kind of material that feels too detailed to be fake. Banks began selling Poyais bonds, official-looking bonds, promising solid returns. Newspapers printed favorable articles. After all, this wasn't some unknown man. This was a decorated officer, a statesman, a man with international experience. Gregor MacGregor had turned himself into a brand. People lined up. Retired soldiers invested their pensions. Middle-class families sold their homes. Doctors, craftsmen, engineers, people with real skills, signed up to emigrate. Parents believed they were giving their children a better future. They weren't chasing fantasy. They thought they were joining history. And Gregor took their money calmly, methodically, as if this was all normal, as if Poyais had always existed and would continue to exist long after him. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He waited until belief had matured into certainty. Then he launched the ships. In 1822, the first ship carrying settlers to Poyais left Britain. Another followed soon after. Hundreds of people on board. They carried official documents identifying them as citizens of Poyais. They carried Poyais currency. They carried instructions on where to settle, how land would be distributed, and what roles they would fill in the new society. The mood on board was hopeful, excited. People talked about farms they would build, businesses they would open, lives they would finally live free of overcrowded Europe. Weeks later, the ships arrived, and there was nothing. No port, no city, no buildings, no St. Joseph. Only jungle. Thick, unmoving jungle. Swamps, insects, heat that crushed the lungs, the sound of life everywhere, but no sign of civilization. At first, confusion replaced excitement. Surely this wasn't the capital. Maybe they were early. Maybe construction was underway inland. They unloaded supplies. They waited. Days passed. Nothing happened. Food began to spoil. Fresh water was scarce. Mosquitoes swarmed constantly. People grew sick. Children developed fevers. Adults collapsed from exhaustion. Some still refused to believe the truth. They clung to hope, because hope was less terrifying than reality. Others began to panic. This was not a delay. This was a lie. People began dying, not quickly, slowly, painfully, from disease, dehydration, infection. They tried to build shelters with no experience and limited tools. They buried their dead in shallow graves. They rationed supplies that were never meant to last this long. And all the while, they waited for help that would never come. Because Poyais did not exist. The settlers did what humans have always done when reality becomes unbearable. They tried to impose order on chaos. Committees were formed. Roles were assigned. Someone declared himself temporary governor, holding up Poyais documents, as if paper could summon a city out of the jungle. They convinced themselves that civilization must be just beyond the tree line, just a few miles inland, hidden by vegetation or delayed by miscommunication. Hope became a survival mechanism, not a belief. Small groups ventured inland to scout. What they found was worse than nothing. The terrain was brutal. Swamps swallowed boots. Rivers looked passable until they weren't. Insects coated skin like a living layer of armor. Within days, men who had been healthy professionals were shaking with fever. Malaria and yellow fever spread quietly, efficiently. There were no hospitals, no doctors with proper supplies, no medicines beyond what had survived the voyage. Children died first. Parents watched fevers climb with nothing to stop them. Skin turned yellow. Breathing slowed. And then there was silence. They buried their children in foreign soil, thousands of miles from the homes they had sold to get here, clinging to a dream that had already rotted. Food became the next enemy. The supplies brought from Britain were never meant to support hundreds of people indefinitely. Rations shrank. Hunting was dangerous and unreliable. Crops could not be planted quickly enough to matter. Water sources were contaminated. Dysentery spread. Weakness followed. People argued. Friendships collapsed. Faith cracked. Some settlers began to fully understand what had happened, that they had not been delayed, misdirected, or unlucky. They had been betrayed. The name Gregor MacGregor started to circulate in whispers, then in anger, then in screams. But there was nowhere to direct that anger. The man who had promised them everything was thousands of miles away, living comfortably, spending their money, and preparing his next move. Months later, a few passing ships noticed something wrong along the coast. Makeshift shelters, emaciated figures waving desperately. Survivors were taken aboard and transported to nearby colonies. What they told authorities sounded impossible. A country that didn't exist. Official documents that meant nothing. Hundreds dead because of a lie so audacious no one had questioned it. When the survivors finally made it back to Britain, they expected justice. They expected outrage. They expected someone to be held accountable. Instead, they encountered confusion. Gregor MacGregor was gone. He had disappeared almost perfectly, slipping through legal cracks that had not been designed for this kind of crime. There was no clear law against inventing a nation. Investors had willingly purchased bonds. Settlers had chosen to emigrate. Contracts were vague. Jurisdiction was unclear. The press eventually caught up. Newspapers that had once praised Poyais now published exposés. Public opinion shifted from excitement to horror. Families demanded answers. Survivors demanded justice. Gregor MacGregor reappeared, not in handcuffs, but in France. And astonishingly, he tried again. New brochures, new maps, new promises. Poyais, he claimed, had suffered temporary setbacks, development delays, political instability. But the future was still bright. The opportunity was still real. Some people believed him, again. French authorities eventually arrested him, but even then the case collapsed. There was no precedent, no easy way to define the crime. Fraud required intent and theft, and Gregor argued that investors had speculated, not been robbed. He was released. Gregor MacGregor would eventually return to South America, where history treated him far more kindly than he deserved. In Venezuela, he was remembered not as a con man, but as a participant in independence movements. He was granted a pension. He lived out his days quietly, comfortably, untouched. He died in 1845, in his bed. No trial, no punishment, no reckoning. The victims were buried in jungles and forgotten by history. So how did this happen? Because Gregor MacGregor understood something deeply unsettling about human psychology. People do not require truth to believe. They require confidence, structure, and permission. He gave them documents, titles, systems, a framework that looked official enough to override doubt. He didn't ask people to imagine a country. He showed them one. Maps convince. Paper convinces. Uniforms convince. And once belief takes hold, it resists collapse even in the face of death. The story of Poyais is not just a historical curiosity. It's a warning, because the mechanisms Gregor used still exist. Authority, complexity, distance, optimism, the promise of belonging to something bigger than yourself. Poyais never existed, but the belief in it was strong enough to kill, and that is the most terrifying truth of all.